Hello everyone! Welcome to our video presentation about Saint Thomas Aquinas. But before anything else, let's get to know about our philosopher and discuss to you all about Saint Thomas and his philosophy. Saint Thomas Aquinas was an Italian Dominican friar, philosopher, Catholic priest, and doctor of the Church. He was born in the year 1225 at Rocaseca, Italy, and died on March 7, 1274, aged 48-49, at Fossa Nova, Italy. He was the foremost classical proponent of natural theology, and the father of Thomism, of which he argued that reason is found in God. Best known works are the disputed Questions on Truth, the Summa contra Gentiles, and the unfinished but massively influential Summa Theologica. However, in this video, we are going to focus more on the unfinished Summa Theologica and the 5 ways of proving God's existence. As its title indicates, is a theological summary. It seeks to describe the relationship between God and man and to explain how man's reconciliation with the divine is made possible at all through Christ.
Approximately one-half of the Summa Theologica then examines the nature and purpose of man. Finally, Aquinas devotes his attention to the nature of Christ and the role of the sacraments in effecting a bridge between God and man. His examination includes questions of how angels act on bodies, the union of body and soul, the cause and remedies of anger, cursing, and the comparison of one sin with another. Aquinas is attempting to offer a truly universal and rational view of all existence. The Summa Theologica is divided into 3 parts, and each of these 3 parts contains numerous subdivisions. First is Part 1. Part 1 is mostly about God. Aquinas attempts to prove that God exists and answers many questions devoted to the subject. He asserts that the notion that God exists is proof itself that He exists, and demonstration of that fact is a possibility, which Aquinas intends to do. He later offers his proofs on God's existence. Next is Part 2. Part 2 of Summa Theologica focuses on man and his purpose on earth. Overall, man's purpose on earth is to be happy. To be happy, man must follow ethical rules and responsibilities, delineated by God. Aquinas acknowledges that perfection by man is unobtainable. Therefore, it was necessary for God to help in man's pursuit of perfection, which is why He created Christ. Man is defined by his soul and intellect, which for Aquinas are one and the same. Intellect is a part of the soul, because reason is inherent within the soul. Despite this, he does recognize that man's entire existence is not solely based on rationality.
Part 2 continues by defining man's intellect. For example, our intellect consists of phantasms or mental images. When man thinks of corporeal object, a phantasm develops in his head. Therefore, our intelligence is not just limited to the corporeal. Man is capable of imagining the concept of infinity, but will ultimately be incapable of fully understanding infinity. The mind can figure out cause and effect to a certain extent, which man can then use to try and attempt to understand God on a deeper level.
Aquinas continues Part 2 by discussing certain virtues and sins. Faith and hope are discussed along with prudence and temperance. Faith and love are ultimately the highest moral principle to ultimately understand and know God. But those two must be in tandem. Perfect love in God is not possible without true faith. Man must harness his intellect to understand love to breed faith. First on, after faith is obtained, only then can man truly love God. Lastly, the third part, the final part of Summa Theologica focuses on Christ. Christ is the mediation between God and man. Man's potential became perfect within Jesus.
All the perfection of faith and love that man could theoretically grasp became possible in Jesus. All of Christ's sacrifices were necessary to obtain deliverance for man. He ultimately became the bridge, allowing God's forgiveness and mankind's sins. His sacrifice came from faith and love.
And that's it for the Summa Theologica. Next is we'll be discussing about Aquinas' 5 ways of proving God's existence.
Aquinas' 5 ways of proving God's existence are the argument from change, the argument from causality, the argument from contingency, the argument from perfection, and lastly, the argument from purpose. First is the argument from change or motion.
Change is immediately apparent in the universe, in the sense that things move from a potential state to an actual state. But this potential is for something that does not yet exist, and so requires something else to actualize it. Whatever actualizes that, in turn, would have to be actualized by something else. Logically, this chain of changes cannot be infinitely long, or else nothing would have to ever change in the first place.
Therefore, there must exist some unchanged and unchanging thing that actualizes all other changes. This principle is not related to time or a sequence of events. Rather, it points out the need to have something capable of causing the changes we observe. God, the unmoved mover. In other words, the first of Aquinas' arguments for God's existence points out that all changes are the result of some other change. But this chain of changes cannot be infinite, so there must be some unchanged or unmoving thing, an unmoved mover, that is ultimately responsible for all other changes or motion.
Next is the argument from causality. Cause and effect are in the universe. Everything that occurs is caused by something else. All events are dependent on some other occurrence or thing in order to make them happen. A thing cannot be the cause of itself, or else it would never exist. Logically, this chain of causation cannot be infinitely long, or nothing would ever have to come to exist in the first place. Therefore, there must be an uncaused thing that causes all other things. This argument is not related to time or a sequence of events. Rather, it considers the fact that all things are dependent on something else for their existence. In other words, the second of Aquinas' ways to show God's existence is based on the fact that all effects are caused by some other event, which in turn is the effect of some other cause. But this chain of causality cannot be infinitely long, so there must be some uncaused cause. God is the first cause. Third is the argument from contingency. Nothing we observe in the universe is necessary. Nothing needs to exist in and of itself. We often observe things that cease to exist, falling victim to death, destruction, and decay. Eventually, all non-necessary things cease to exist. But if it were possible for everything to cease to exist, and if there has been an infinite amount of past time, then all things would have already ceased to exist. There would be nothing left at all. The fact that anything exists at all, even now, means there must be one thing that cannot cease to exist. One thing that must necessarily exist. There must be one thing that is non-contingent. For example, its existence is not dependent on anything else. In other words, Aquinas' third argument, or way to prove God's existence, is that if everything were impermanent, eventually everything would cease to be. Therefore, there must be at least one thing that must necessarily exist. One non-contingent thing, God, the necessary being.
Fourth is the argument from perfection.
Every trait we see in every object is compared to some standard: health, morality, strength, and so forth. The fact that we instinctively see degrees in these areas implies that there is some ultimate standard to judge that property, and all comparative properties share a common sense of perfection.
This means there must be some ultimate standard of perfection from which to judge all other properties. Those objects cannot be the source or definition of that property in and of themselves. In other words, Aquinas' fourth argument in favor of God's existence points out that in order to speak of goodness or power, we must have an absolute standard against which to judge those terms. There must be some other thing from which they ultimately derive that characteristic, God, the ultimate standard.
The argument from purpose.
Many things in the universe drive toward a particular end, not random results. Magnets drive to seek metal or to align their poles. Seeds drive to become adult plants, not animals. This regularity, as opposed to randomness, is a sign of purpose, of intention or intelligence. However, magnets and seeds such have no intelligence of their own.
Therefore, their drive must be the result of some external intelligence, setting or fixing or designing their behavior. In some means or mechanism, all purposes and functions must originate in some intelligent entity. In other words, Aquinas' fifth way to show the existence of God involves the fact that inanimate matter and energy do not exhibit intelligence or purpose. When we see something unintelligent that appears to have some specific purpose or that fulfills some purposeful role, we must assume that thing to have been given that purpose by some other intelligence. Ultimately, this leads to God, the grand designer.
And that was it for St. Thomas Aquinas and the Summa Theologica.
We hope you learned something from this presentation. Till next time, ciao!